There we go. Good evening and welcome to the New Hampshire House Progressive Caucus Candidates Forum for the State Senate Democratic Primary in District 15. My name is Chris Schultz. I'm a state representative from Concord and chair of the House Progressive Caucus. The House Progressive Caucus was founded by State Representative Ellen Reed and other Bernie Sanders supporters almost 4 years ago in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Now we're a big and growing diverse group of state reps, and we want real change for New Hampshire. We want to make sure New Hampshire state government works for all granite staters, not the privileged few. Real change can't just happen in the House chamber, though. To achieve real change, we need to make sure that we have a governor that's progressive, that we have executive counselors that are progressive, and as we're showing tonight, state senators who are progressive, so that we can have a real progressive coalition to work for the best, for the needs of granite staters across the state. This is our 4th of 7 forums. I'd like to do a special thank you to Representatives Sophia Wazir and Sue Vale, who have done the lion's share of work to pull these together. To our moderators, including tonight's moderator, Marjorie Smith, who's State Representative Marjorie Smith, who stepped in at the last minute because of an illness, and our timekeeper, Representative Catherine Rogers, who is my state rep. So on that note, I hand it over to you, Representative Smith.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I'm delighted to be here. Senate District 15 is an important district. Of course, all the districts are important, but because it includes Concord, Henniker, Hopkinton, and Warner, there's a concentration of a lot of people who care about what is happening in state government. The 3 candidates for the Democratic nomination for Senate are Candace Bouchard, Paul Hodes, and Rebecca Whitley. We look forward to hearing the candidates' views on a number of issues that are of concern to all of us. The format will be that I'll ask a question and then provide up to 90 seconds for each of the candidates to respond. Our able timekeeper, Kathy Rogers, will signal a warning when 15 seconds are left. For the first questions, I'll start with Candace. If anyone who is listening has a question, please enter the question in the chat and I will try to get to it. As we near the end of this forum, each candidate will have 2 minutes to sum up his or her candidacy. So starting with Candace and then going to Paul and Rebecca, the first question has to do with family and medical leave. As you know, the governor is amused by this concept. He has referred to it as a vacation, has vetoed the bill twice, and auctioned off his veto message at a Republican fundraiser. What is your position on family and medical leave, and how do you think we can get there? Candace?
Thank you, Margie, and thank everyone for being here tonight and for moderating. I definitely support family leave. Other states have done it. Family leave works. We have seen during this pandemic that the lack of family leave and what it has done to the citizens of our state and to our healthcare system when people don't feel that they can leave a job or get healthcare when they do leave a job or take care of a family member. I believe that we keep putting a bill forward, we keep fighting for our values and our beliefs, and let the governor keep vetoing it. So far, we haven't been able to find common ground with the governor. There is such common ground. I would be glad to work with the governor on that if he's fortunate enough to be our next governor. But I definitely will go forward supporting family leave as I always had as I've had in the past and have said throughout this campaign. So I think we stick to our values and keep fighting for our values no matter who's in that corner office. So,
thanks, Candace. Paul?
I'm a strong supporter of paid family and medical leave. Um, it's really a question of the fundamental values. And I think that, well, one of the things that is really going to be critical is, one, if we can build a veto-proof majority and Sununu is still governor, that would be a good way to deal with this. I'm not sure what the political prospects for that are. But it's really also important that Democrats focus on values in everything that we talk about and in all our messaging. Because if the governor continues to veto paid family and medical leave, he's really standing against families. He's standing against families who need to take care of kids or their loved ones. He is against families. That's a pretty powerful message. And we stand for families. We stand for keeping families together. We need to give people the opportunities that they need to take care of their loved ones. The pandemic has made it abundantly clear just how important it is to be able to take time away from work, paid, not unpaid, and have paid family and medical leave. It's a critical policy and an important underlying value for us.
Thank you very much. Rebecca.
Hi there. So I'm Becky Whitley. Thanks to everyone for hosting us tonight and everyone who's joining. I really appreciate the opportunity. So this is a personal issue for me. I was when I had my son, who is now almost 7, I was practicing as a staff attorney at the Disability Rights Center, which is actually a pretty progressive organization, but I myself didn't have paid leave. What I was offered was 4 months unpaid, and that was a real struggle for my family. And, you know, we made it work so I could stay home a little bit with my son after he was born, but it was only because my mother actually lived close by to us that it was something that was doable for us. So it's a personal issue. I absolutely support paid family and medical leave. It's a critical issue to the vast majority of Granite Staters, and we know that. And I also know that the future of our state really does depend on what we do to attract and retain young folks to New Hampshire. And I think a big way that we can do that is to send a message from the State House that we are a family-friendly state, and we want young folks to come here and put roots down and thrive. And so I think paid family leave is a critical policy to send a message to young folks that we want them to come in New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question, and we'll be starting with Paul. 10 years ago, New Hampshire linked its minimum wage to the federal minimum wage, and it has been stuck at $7.25. Where would you like to see our minimum wage, and how do you think we can get there?
Look, I think we're in a place where we need to recognize that we need systemic change. We need it nationally, and we need it in New Hampshire. Along with paid family and medical leave, I think the idea of a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage is one that is a crucial bulwark of the values we represent and where we want New Hampshire to be. I support a $15 an hour living wage. Now, I know that the legislature sent the governor a $12 an hour wage, which he's vetoed. I don't think that incrementalism on this is going to get us anywhere. I think we need to send a loud and clear message that $15 an hour is a minimum living wage. I mean, we haven't seen a rise for so many decades. It's crazy. If we adjusted were really adjusted for inflation, we'd be way above $15 an hour. So I think we keep pushing on it. And again, we send the values message that we're with working families, we're with working people.
15 seconds.
And we need a living wage that will work for lifting people out of poverty and just being able to afford the basics.
Thank you. Becky.
Yeah, I think this is it's a nice question to follow the previous question, because again, what are we doing to ensure the future economic security of our state. And this is job number one, I think, is setting a minimum wage. I think it's unconscionable that we don't have a state minimum wage, that it's tied to the federal government. And, I think the governor has made very clear that he doesn't stand up for working families. So this is job number one. And I think even before this crisis, even before the pandemic, New Hampshire families were experiencing strains and rising costs on a whole host of places. And I think as we come out of the recovery, we need to put working families first. And setting a minimum wage is, that biggest message that we can send to working families, that we're working for them. I agree that we need to set it at a living wage at $15. And I am open to doing whatever possible to get as many folks to the table to support a minimum wage. Whether do we need to, work towards that in a couple of years to get small businesses ready for it, I'm willing to discuss that also, but I do agree that it needs to be set at a livable wage. And I also think that it needs to be set at something that's going to continue to rise with cost. So some sort of index that's going to allow the minimum wage to rise with costs, with real costs, rather than having to go back to the legislature every time we need to increase the minimum wage.
Thank you. Candace?
Well, I think we all agree we got to increase the minimum wage. I mean, $7.25 an hour, I think it was set back in 2009. And I think the purchasing power has declined by 17% with the minimum wage. And I do think it's possible for our capitalist system to allow both for the support of unions and tax policies that have benefited the super wealthy, that they can also afford to have policies that we can increase the minimum wage. I think that we can start working with employers who have, said, they're just not, they're not going to support it, and a governor that doesn't support it, by bringing up the argument that, we've seen within this pandemic that people are unemployed. Unfortunately, to supplement their unemployment check, they are getting increased money from the federal government. And that's no small coincidence that our economy is 70% of our economy is consumer driven. So not only do we need to live in a wage so the middle class can flourish again, and the unessential workers can have, not feel housing insecure and food insecure. It's also good for our economy. And I think we stick to our values. We fight for $15 an hour. It's not enough. It should be around $23 an hour. And I agree with Paul and Becky, it needs to be indexed so we don't end up in this, stuck at an unreasonable wage as we go forward in the future. So I definitely support fighting for an increase in minimum wage. Thank you.
Thank you. Continuing in the same area generally of compensation, do you think state construction contracts should require that prevailing wage be paid? And I'm going to add another part of that question, again dealing with compensation, and that has to do with state employees. The state employees do not have a contract. The governor has been unwilling to pay attention to the absence of that contract and to the suggestions that have come in from non-biased sources about what he ought to do. So again, relating to compensation in terms of state contracts and state employees. And let me begin this with Becky.
Yes, absolutely. I think that state construction contracts should require prevailing wage. We need to set a standard in state government. In terms of state employee contract, it's unconscionable, again, that they don't have a contract. I think in general, I believe to my core in the power of a united and organized voice, and that we need more power in the hands of workers. New Hampshire is already a state where, workers have been under attack, and it goes without saying that I will support, workers' right to organize, maintain representation in a union, bargain collectively, and fight for workers' rights to organize. And, I think again, going back to the importance of ensuring New Hampshire is a place that, can succeed in the future. I think, protection of our workers to form and strengthen unions, fair wages, safe workplaces, that's a critical thing that we're going to need to do to send a message again to that New Hampshire is a place that people should come and put down roots and thrive.
Thank you. Candace.
Thank you. I do support having the municipalities follow the same as the federal contracts, which I think is the Davis-Bacon Act, but I'm not sure. But I think we've seen that, people need to make a livable wage. There are contracts out there, and we need to be able to value the workers and to make sure that all workers, no matter whether you have a state contract and the municipal contract, that you're being paid a fair wage. And I think too, we, as taxpayers and citizens, we have to realize that doing this on the municipal end might increase cost a bit, but it's the right thing to do. And I think we need to go forward with that. And also, with the state employee contract, of course, we need to fight for the state employee contract. They deserve to have, their wages increased. They deserve to have their benefits kept intact. And I definitely support, getting them a fair contract and getting that signed somehow. But I think we also have to remember that we just got to keep fighting for these values. This isn't the first time we've had a governor not wanting to sign a labor contract with the state employees. And I think going forward in COVID, and as we look at the budget that's going to be coming forward, that we protect the benefits of our retirees and our public workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
I'm a member of a union. I'm a proud member of the Local 374 of the American Federation of Musicians, which is an affiliate of the AFL-CIO. Ever since my days in Congress, I've had a 100% voting record with the AFL-CIO. So yes to a prevailing wage, yes to a state employee's contract, but there's a lot more going on that we have to be vigilant about. We have to make sure that we oppose so-called right to work in the most strenuous and organized way. We have to deal with the misclassification of workers that is hurting our union workers with inadequate policies at the State Department of Labor that aren't really keeping up with what's going on out in the workplace. So union membership has fallen. It's really important, and it's important as a state legislator to support unions. The right to organize is a fundamental right at this point. The governor and his corporate cronies clearly are opposed. We've got to stand strong with our union brothers and sisters and make sure that working people have champions, and not just advocates, but champions, which is what I'll be as your state senator.
Thank you very much. A functioning democracy depends upon a fair and equitable system of voting where every citizen has access to the polls and to the politicians. First, since when they say it's not the money, it always is the money. Could you share your views on campaign financing, including who should be able to contribute, contribution limits, and reporting? And let's begin with Candace.
Thank you. I think campaign financing, we need to, running these elections has just become outrageously expensive. But I think if we're transparent on who's giving to the campaign and how much they are giving to the campaign, and the citizens can look on the Secretary of State's website and see who has given to your campaign and who you took money from. I think that's a good thing that the state is doing. But I think there also needs to be limits. There needs to be, the caps we have now, I believe it's $1,000. I think the caps are good. And I think But going forward, I think the real issue is transparency and just being very, very open and having the laws be very, very clear on who gives to you and how much they have given.
Thank you. Paul?
I've actually helped lead the fight on campaign finance reform when I was in Congress. And now that I'm running for state office, I find it kind of fascinating that before you register for an office, at least in pursuing the state Senate, there's this loophole that allows people to give $5,000 and then more money. So we have plenty of loopholes in New Hampshire that are affecting the way our elections are run. I agree that transparency is critical. The $1,000 limit is critical, but people are amazed when I tell them how much money is being raised for a job that pays $100 a year. And we all the three of us, are spending way too much time on the telephone calling people who used to be our friends and asking them for money. So I think we could come up with a much better system that, especially in New Hampshire, where democracy is so vibrant and everybody in the state legislature is making so little money, we can figure out a system, I think, that better reflects the financial realities of what we're dealing with. I don't want people spending time on the telephone all the time as candidates.
Thank you. Becky?
Yeah, this is another one that's really personal for me, and something, as a first-time candidate, I don't have wealthy friends, we're all working families, and this is something that I have felt deeply. So I absolutely believe that we need to level the playing field and get big money out of politics. That's just the foundation. I think particularly in New Hampshire, transparency is important, but I think we need to go further. I think we need to close the LLC loophole that so many folks have been able to use to raise a lot of money and without transparency. I think we need to update our outdated campaign finance system with the Secretary of State. There's a lot of work to be done there to make it easier for candidates to be as transparent as possible. I personally have not taken one single dollar of PAC money or corporate donations. And I also took the pledge to not take any money from fossil fuel companies or PACs. And I will continue to do that. That's really important to me. The vast majority of my donors are grassroots donors. Those are, $50 and under. And we've been able to garner an incredible amount of support for my campaign just on the issues, talking about the issues, and have enjoyed a lot of grassroots support that way.
Thank you very much. The next question, again in the area of voting, and I'll begin this with Paul. The issue of automatic voter registration comes up with some frequency. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of such a system, and how would you envision it working? Special time-limited legislation is currently in place to permit people to vote absentee if they choose not to vote in person out of concerns related to the current pandemic. So would you support, or what are your views on automatic voter registration and on no-fault absentee voting?
Well, welcome to the 21st century, where we have remarkable digital means to communicate. Here we are Zooming instead of meeting in person. Email and texting are ubiquitous. I think we can figure out how to have automatic voter registration that works, whether through digital means or the mail or however we want to do it, but we ought to have automatic voter registration. We, of course, need to preserve New Hampshire's same-day registration. That's critical. We need to stand vigilant against the voter suppression efforts of the Republicans. We need independent districts for gerrymandered voting. I am a supporter of mail-in voting or no-fault absentee voting, whichever you want to call it. I know that we've had a 1-year extension for the pandemic. I think it ought to become a permanent extension. And also, if you take a look at the multiple steps that need to happen to get your absentee ballot, fill it out, and get it in, that's much more complicated than it should be. We need no-fault mail-in voting, and it needs to be made easy, and it
15
needs to
seconds.
be made available to every voter in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Becky?
Yeah, this is an important question right now as we're seeing just, Republicans actively trying to disenfranchise voters through false information. So I think we need to do everything possible to ensure that all eligible voters have access to the polls. And I think there's work to be done to protect and expand voting rights in New Hampshire, all across the country. And even in New Hampshire, we have seen legislation to disenfranchise voters, and particularly students and communities of color. And we need to make sure our efforts in protecting voting rights protect those communities. I think absolutely we should invest in automatic and online voter registration. That seems like a no-brainer to me. Make it easier for eligible people to vote, protect same-day registration. I absolutely agree with that. I think we should even contemplate early voting in New Hampshire, which we are, thinking about. And we need to continue to build on what we're doing right now during the pandemic and support election day safety, and do more voting by mail, no excuse absentee voting, because of course no one should be forced to choose between their health and their right to vote. I think the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy.
15 seconds.
And I think we also need to think about, ensuring that we're encouraging our students to vote also, and making sure it's part of our civic education curriculum in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Candace?
Thank you, Margie. I agree with everything that Becky and Paul said. Is same day registration, mail-in voting, the so-called absentee ballot we're doing now should be permanent, and it should be no obstacles to citizens registering to vote. So I agree with everything they said, and I think at this point in time, we all have to stand up, even though it's a federal issue, loud and clear, and support the post office, and speak out against the dismantling of the post office. And, the Republican Party has consistently tried to block voting from minority groups and students. And I think once again, we stand up to our values loud and clear and make voting a right of every citizen. So thank you.
Thank you. This next question, I'm going to start with Becky. The governor has vetoed 2 independent redistricting commission bills in the last 2 years. These bills were designed to remove politics when new district lines have to be drawn, as they do every 10 years, based on the decennial census. The next legislature will have the task of establishing new lines for the U.S. Congress, Executive Council, and the New Hampshire House and Senate. If Democrats are in control of the State House and Senate, would you prefer that the system stays as it is, or would you support independent redistricting? Beginning with Becky.
Great, thanks for that question. I would absolutely support, even if the Democrats are in the majority, I would support an independent redistricting commission. I think this would go a long way to reducing gerrymandering and getting, making the whole redistricting process less partisan. I think that will go a long way for people to trust the process again. Like you said, Governor Sununu vetoed this bill twice. And if I remember correctly, this is your bill, Representative. And what he said when he vetoed the bill was that the current system was just fine. We don't have any gerrymandering. It's very rare. But that means that our governor has not looked at a map of Senate District 8 that's wildly gerrymandered, the Executive Council District 2 that looks like a full salamander across the state. So of course we have gerrymandering in New Hampshire, and I think we need to take the partisan politics out of that, because elected officials should not have the sole authority to choose their voters. It should be the opposite way. Thanks.
Thank you. Candace?
I definitely would support as Democrats, and of course we will be the majority, not to gerrymander. I mean, it's just not fair to the voters. And I think as Democrats, we have stood up before for our principles and values when we became a majority. I remember under Speaker Norelli, we all voted to get rid of straight ticket voting, even though we were in power, and straight ticket voting was something the Republicans always relied on to stay in power. But we held to our values. We voted, straight ticket voting. We ended that little checkbox. And I think as Democrats, we will once again stand up for our values and the gerrymandering way that has been done for redistricting. So
Thank you. Paul?
Marjorie, thanks for your work on this. I agree with what Rebecca and Candace have said. We obviously should have an independent commission that sets the lines for the districts. The second part of your question really gets deep into both politics and values. As Democrats, if we don't stand up for doing what's right, we lose the moral ground that we care about in speaking to voters and doing. The reason we're all in this is to do what's right by the voters of New Hampshire, to do what's right for our democracy, to make this a better state, to make things work better. So it's obvious to me that doing what's right, not necessarily what's easy, is the value that we've got to uphold. That says an independent commission is the way to go.
Thank you. Moving to another topic, New Hampshire does not have a publicly funded transportation system. What is your position on passenger rail? And are there other proposals to increase the availability of public transportation that you would like to work for? And beginning with Candace.
Thank you, Margie. With rail, I actually amended the original rail bill to include Concord in the Capital Quarter. The problem with funding is with everything in this state, there is just not enough funding. And the way our Constitution is written, we can't take highway money, gas tax money to put into rail. So we need to look for some kind of public-private partnership and some other funding, state money for the for rail, and along with federal money. As far as in public transportation, I wholeheartedly support public transportation. There's a way you can use sometimes CMAQ funds and toll credits to help fund public transportation. Those have worked in the past, but I think with this state, we really, really lack in public transportation. I did sit with former Senator Larson and in a meeting with bus transit and the Manchester Airport. And we tried to get buses to go to the Manchester Airport, and because now if you're north of Manchester, you go right to Boston. That didn't seem to work out at the time. We were in a recession, but out of that, there are now Manchester transit buses that come into Concord and back. Also, I think with COVID, I think we really, really have to start looking not only at more intra and intercity buses, but also look at a transportation corridor that is either hybrid or electric, so we can get the carbon off our roads and we can get some clean air. So it's a complicated issue. It's always in New Hampshire. I support it, but how do I fund it, and how do I stay within the Constitution of regarding our highway funds? So.
Thank you, Candace. Paul?
A very brief story about rail. So I got one trip when I was a congressman on Air Force One with President Obama, and the state had missed a deadline to apply for funds for the study, the original rail study. And I asked the president, I've never asked you for anything, just do one thing for me. Can we reinstate the money for the rail study? And the next week, Secretary of Transportation LaHood was in my office with Donnelly Lozo from Nashua, and we were able to restore the money that came from the federal government for the rail study. So I'm a big supporter of public transportation. It's critical for in a modern society for people to be able to have the kind of public transportation which is ubiquitous in Europe but is missing here. It's really important for the environment that we start transitioning as much as possible from fossil fuels to a clean energy environment. That includes electric buses, it includes trains, it includes multimodal transportation. It's critical in a rural state to have a fleet that can take people to healthcare appointments and to their jobs. So I'm a big supporter of rail. I understand there are funding issues, but we've got to be a strong supporter of the underlying principle that we need the public transportation system. Then we can look to the federal government and other state resources for the help in making it happen.
Thank you. Becky.
I'm also a supporter of public transportation and passenger rail, and for two reasons. For equity reasons, we need to make sure that folks have access to jobs. And a good way we can do that is to help them with transportation. From when I was at the Disability Rights Center, a lot of my clients were so low income, they couldn't afford transportation, which means they couldn't afford to get to their jobs. So it's an equity issue. It's also a climate issue. You know, our current cars, trucks, buses are a major source of air pollution and the largest single source of greenhouse gas pollution in New Hampshire. It's the largest source. And I think that, you know, passenger rail and public transportation will go a long way towards building a modern and clean energy economy in New Hampshire. And I think we need to make mass transit a priority. One way that we can do to fund it is simply by New Hampshire joining the transportation-focused companion of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, TCI. Our governor has been resistant to that, but our fellow New England states have joined that. And, you know, I think with the high rates of asthma in New Hampshire, with the climate goals we want to accomplish, and with getting folks back to work, I think, you know, it's a no-brainer for New Hampshire to join that TCI part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And there will be funds available through that.
Thank you very much. Speaking of transportation, that's going to bring me to the third rail. And we'll begin this with Paul. And the third rail, of course, is public education funding. The pandemic has made clear to everyone that serious inequities exist in our public education system and in how we fund it. And what is happening now, the differences are exacerbated as children are expected to learn from home, children who might not have access to computers, homes which might not have access to internet. But internet, computers, technologies are just part of the problem. Currently, the local property tax is the central source for educational funding. How do you see the system change? If you do, how would you pay for such a system? That I thought was an easy question, so we're going to begin with Paul.
I always appreciate a softball question. We have a school funding commission that's working now. They just got a report from the American Institutes of Research who confirmed that our tax system is regressive. The way we fund schools in it is inequitable, unfair, and I say unconstitutional. There's about $3.2 billion of the approximately $13 billion biennium budget that's devoted to education. Some say that if we simply redistribute it fairly, there's enough money in the system. But Marjorie, as you point out, costs are increasing. Districts like Hopkinton are facing tough choices about their budgets all the time. And there's no doubt that more revenue is going to be needed in the state budget, even if we fix the funding problems so that we are distributing more fairly and equitably to those schools that need it. Right now, what the state pays in supposed adequacy base
15 seconds.
is inadequate. We're going to have to look at other sources of revenue. That may be the estate tax on high value estates, dealing with the income tax for high income earners, perhaps a capital gains tax, a securities transaction tax. And finally, what at the base we've got to do is make sure that we fix the inequities in the system.
Thank you very much. Rebecca.
Yeah, this is also sort of a frontline issue for me. I have a son who's going into first grade, and it took Hopkinton 3 times to pass a budget. So we need to make broad changes that will ensure all of our children have access to an appropriate education, regardless of zip code, and that ends divisiveness in small communities, which is very painful. So I think, talking about values again, as Democrats, we need to stay steadfast and stay connected to our values and move away from a zero-sum budgeting process that we have become accustomed to in New Hampshire, and where we're forced to choose between mental health and public education, choose between vulnerable families and other services. And I just feel like we need to move away from that being the norm. You know, currently we rely on very limited business taxes, on property taxes, of course, and tourism-driven revenues. So we know that revenues will be down, and that it will be our obligation to relook at the system, reform our tax structure, and move away from crushing property taxpayers that only disadvantages older folks, young families, working families, and communities of color. And those are the very people we need to focus on in the
15
recovery.
seconds.
And so absolutely, I am willing to have any conversation about income tax. I think we need to take a hard look at business taxes and support property taxpayers and working families over wealthy out-of-state corporations.
Thank you. Candace?
Thank you. I think we can all agree that the way we fund our schools, that, you know, there are winners and losers in ours, and the property taxes are, you know, the crushing some families. But I don't want to get ahead of the commission. We have a commission that is still working. And I think, you know, when they come out, I'd like to see what their plans are, and then we can have a discussion on how do we go forward. But I'm very hopeful that this commission, who's come out with one report, and the second report is, I think, due out in December, that we can then have hopefully some solutions put on the table that we can work towards. And as you know, Margie, get away from the spreadsheet wars that we've had in the past every time we come up with education funding, because then it just becomes what's my town, is it winning or losing? So I'm waiting for the commission's report, and want to go forward with their recommendations, or at least have them on the table and discuss them. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca, a major environmental issue is PFAS and the protection of our water, much of which will be paid for with federal funds. However, we also have a crisis with regard to our aging wastewater systems that don't have a federal source of payment. How would you pay for this billion-dollar crisis of municipal wastewater over the coming years?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I just want to start out with the fundamental notion that access to safe and clean drinking water is a human right. And we need to protect what makes New Hampshire so unique. You know, our lakes, ponds, and streams contribute to our way of life and economy. And absolutely, we need to focus on our drinking water and our infrastructure. And again, I think how we're going to fund that comes back to overall tax policy. Again, we have a lot of needs with our aging infrastructure in New Hampshire. So I think we're not going to, you know, we have to have that hard conversation about where that money is going to come from. I think a conversation about income tax, this district, I'm on the phone every single day with voters in this district, and they are ready to have that conversation about massive tax reform. You know, putting income tax aside, again, we need to look to our business taxes. Right now, you know, we are giving major handouts to major corporations on the backs of property taxpayers. So I think that is the first place we need to look coming out of the recession, that we're definitely going to be moving into for additional revenues.
Thank you. Candace.
Thank you. I agree. This is a problem, and you know, we all need safe water and water systems that work. Unfortunately, when these laws are passed under the Gold Dome, what happens to municipality and towns? The cost of these upgrades and changes and safety, which need to be done, fall on the local taxpayers. So it would be my position as we go forward with these programs that when we pass these laws, that there is funding included, so it doesn't pass down to the municipalities, whether it's in forms of grants or even low interest loans. But I think when we make these needed reforms, we got to also realize that when it goes down to the cities and towns, that their taxpayers are paying for it. So I think when we pass these laws, we have to have a funding mechanism in the law to help the cities and towns, so it isn't a hit on our communities. Thank you.
Paul?
When I was a prosecutor, very early in my career, I prosecuted the first case that sent polluters to jail for polluting drinking water at the Gilson Road Superfund site in Nashua. So it's something I've been interested in for a long time. Clearly, I agree with Rebecca that safe drinking water is a right, and it's got to be a priority for all of us. The regressive tax system that we have is clearly a candidate for change in how we're going to pay for what the municipalities need. One thing to note is after the last recession, when the Republicans were in control, they pushed down costs to the municipalities. It's something we can't do when we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 and the budget problems we're going to have. We cannot pass unfunded mandates or push down costs to the municipalities. So all the things that we're going to need to do to reform the regressive tax structure, find additional revenue, are important. One of the other things we can do is tied in to the environment, which is wastewater treatment plants are energy hogs for municipalities. I've been working in the private sector on solarizing wastewater treatment plants as one of the chief ways we can help municipalities save enormous costs with their wastewater treatment plants. So the environmental policy and tax policies are tied into what we need to do to help with the wastewater treatment plant issue for municipalities.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to the area of energy. You know, it's a topic that we could spend the entire evening on, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about net energy metering limits, about using RGGI funds dedicated to energy efficient projects, or any other ideas that you have about ways that we can move our energy policies into a more responsible area than they have been. And I'd like to begin with Candace.
Thank you. I definitely agree with, you know, the net metering, and I support RGGI. And, you know, it's a complex issue. You know, not one green energy source is going to fix our carbon issues. So I think we have to, be smart. I think we have to come up with a plan. I think we have to, you know, have a plan that's wind, that's solar. And I think also we need to start looking at building an electric vehicle grid throughout the state, so we can enable electric vehicles so people will buy them and realize they have a place to power up. But I think it's the transportation sector that we need to focus on to get our clean air so we can get more hybrid cars, vehicles that aren't producing carbon, and support that, but in a smart way where we go forward with an energy plan that is solar, that's wind, that's different fuels that aren't polluting our air. And I think we've started moving in that direction, and I think we just got to keep moving in that direction and be smart about it and have a plan. And I believe we can do that as a state. Start moving, and now is the perfect time to do it because people see what clean air is like. And I'm very excited to, if elected, have an opportunity to moving our state to a green energy environment. So,
Thank you, Paul.
We need to transition from a fossil fuel economy to a clean, renewable energy economy. One of the first things we can do is set a goal of net zero by 2050, joining other states in the region. The chief impediment to real progress on energy is a governor who's a climate denier, comes from a family of climate deniers whose father single-handedly killed progress on climate change back in the 80s. So that's a political issue. We absolutely should expand the net metering. I say remove the net metering caps so we can have large-scale solar development. That means dealing with the utilities who are currently lining the pockets of the governor and his cronies. But net metering is really critical. RGGI funds, of course, should be used for energy efficiency. Energy efficiency in our buildings, in our residences, in our commercial and institutional buildings is the low-hanging fruit. It's why I oppose the gas pipeline, because I said I'd rather spend the $400 million that consumers are going to have to pay on energy efficiency as opposed to paying for more fossil fuel. So we're going to need a comprehensive approach. But as a state, we're going to need to set goals that bring us into the 21st century about this, because the future is happening. New Hampshire is lagging, and I intend to be a champion for a clean, green, renewable energy economy.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Yeah, this is another issue that's really close to my heart. I spent a few years when my son was a baby as a climate organizer with the Environmental Defense Fund. And I think that New Hampshire can go a long way to make significant investments in the clean energy economy. And I agree that that is a critical part of our state's effort to rebuild in a post-pandemic economy. So I think we need to transition to 100% clean and renewable energy. And I think a critical step to doing that is developing a codified climate action plan. We have had climate action plans in New Hampshire. We need to codify that and make that law. That's shown in other states to drive innovation and create jobs. Mandatory emission reduction targets. Of course, we need to build and improve upon RGGI, which has been a very successful program in both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and bringing some money into the state. Currently, RGGI funds are just given back to ratepayers, which doesn't impact folks like us. It impacts large companies. And so we're just given that money back, which does nothing towards our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think we can, as I mentioned before, I think we should absolutely join the transportation portion of RGGI. I think that will go a long way in accessing funds. Of course, we need to raise the cap on net metering. And New Hampshire lags in renewable energy. Net metering is like a no-brainer. That's low-hanging fruit also. We also need to use all means available in the renewable portfolio standard and set ambitious but achievable renewable energy goals. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Paul, many have pointed to the criminal justice system as a major center of racism in New Hampshire of all states, where we are second only to Maine in terms of being the whitest state in the nation. Governor Sununu even set up a commission to look at police accountability, but has balked at looking at systemic racism in our statutes. Do you have suggestions for changes that should be made in our criminal justice system to make it move more to a system that we believe reflects the values of a democratic society?
Thanks, Marjorie. You know, I'm a former prosecutor and a former criminal defense lawyer. I defended a young black man who was wrongly accused by the police of assault and resisting arrest, and got a firsthand look at what happens in a system where unconscious but systemic racism exists. And it certainly exists in New Hampshire. Although the population is changing, especially in our big cities, there's a lot of work to do. First, on the police side, we need to deal at the very root with our police training. There's nothing in the current manuals and training about implicit bias. There's nothing about systemic racism in the training. There's no sensitivity being introduced, and the training for our police officers is much shorter than it needs to be. In Europe, it takes years to become a police officer. Here, it takes a matter of months. In police departments, we need to make sure there is ongoing training and disclosure about systemic bias. There's currently a list of police officers' misconduct that is not transparent and not made public. That needs to be made public. And in our court system, we need transparency about outcomes. We need training for judges. We need training for lawyers. The Bar Association has an important role to play here. So both in police and the courts, our criminal justice system needs to have a full-scale effort to root out systemic racism and do it on a consistent, sustained basis.
Thank you. Becky?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I have been following the lead on the demands from the Black Lives Matter movement and the young folks in Change for Concord who have been, you know, leading the way on this. And what they're calling for, I support. Criminal justice reform, supporting bail reform, legalizing, regulating, and taxing cannabis with common sense policies to advance public health. And very importantly, tougher laws that govern misconduct for police. And I think this is multi-pronged. We need to create and ensure that Lori's list is public. We need to have a police registry for misconduct. We need to mandate reporting of use of force incidents. We need to ban flat out racial and religious profiling. I think that we need to take a hard look at the police academy and demilitarize the police academy, make it more educational. We need to increase training for implicit and racial bias, mental health awareness, conflict de-escalation, use of force, and an officer's duty to intervene when another officer is misbehaving in any sort of way. And lastly, we need to invest in our communities rather than increase our police budgets.
Thank you very much. Candace?
Thank you. I agree with both Becky and Paul. I think they hit all the points. And I do believe that the Governor's Commission needs to stay permanent. As a city councilor, I'm on the Public Safety Committee. We have been working on this issue. We've had our Chief of Police in. We've had him answer questions on the 8 Can't Wait. And we're also going to be reviewing at our next meeting the citizens' complaint and how does that work in the transparency and does that need to be changed. So on a local level, I've been working with it, and I believe on a state level, we got to keep up with this. This isn't something that we speak to this month, next year, but it is something that needs to be permanent, and we keep working on to make ourselves a better state and recognize that there is systemic racism. And look at our courts, and especially our juvenile justice system. There was an article in today's Union Leader that spoke about the juvenile justice system and the changes that need to be there for the youth going in front of the courts. So, thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I think I've run out of saying third rail issues, but here's another one. Gun protection. Polls show that the public overwhelmingly favors background checks, but the legislature has not been successful in passing such legislation. what is your position of background checks, and are there other proposals relative to gun protection that you would support? And I think we begin with Rebecca on this.
Yes, thank you. So I think that gun violence is a public health crisis nationwide, and something that we really need to address in New Hampshire. To me, a public health crisis also needs public health solutions. It is a preventable thing, and it doesn't mean ripping guns away from responsible gun owners unless, you know, you want assault weapons, which I don't think have any place in civil society. So I absolutely would support closing background check loopholes, particularly in a state like New Hampshire, where guns are sold at gun shows and flea markets and by a whole host of other unlicensed providers. I think we also need to really look at creating a waiting period between the purchase and delivery of firearms, which, coming from a mental health background, working with folks, individuals with mental illness, this would save lives. Another thing that we need to look at is really clarifying the statewide Gun-Free Schools Act. This is a huge concern of mine as a parent. I don't want to be scared to send my 6-year-old to school. I also don't want him to come home from school and tell me how traumatic it was to do those drills where they have to sit in the corner of the cabinets and hug each other tight until the drill is done. It's traumatizing for our children, and it's just, there are no places for guns in schools. I also think we need to pass an extreme risk protection law, a red flag law, again, because firearms don't belong in the hands of dangerous people.
Thank you. Paul?
We have an epidemic.
Oh, no, wait. I go to Candace next, and I'm sorry. My first mistake on that one. I've done pretty well. This is the 12th question. Candace.
You've done more than pretty well. I think we all agree on the gun issue that, you know, we need sensible gun laws. We need to, you know, the reason I think that we are all pretty much in agreement on this issue, I think all 3 candidates we all have the distinction of being Moms Demand Action gun sense candidates. So I think going forward, I think you would see that District 15 is very lucky to have 3 candidates that agree on the issue that we need to enforce gun safety and move forward on gun sense legislation. And keep working on those bills that the governor keeps vetoing, and just keep putting them back in front if he is still in that corner office when we get there. So thank you.
Paul?
What I was starting to say, but is that we have a sad epidemic of teen suicides. We have the highest rate of teen suicides in the nation per capita, and 90% of suicides in New Hampshire are gun related. So yes to universal background checks, yes to gun-free school zones at the state level, not leaving it up to municipalities, yes to red flag laws, which the governor vetoed, appropriate waiting periods, of course, and we've got to close the gun show loopholes. But also what happens with guns and our suicide rates is also related to an underlying sense, I think, of despair and hopelessness in the state among folks that's driven by lots of factors. A culture of violence in the 21st century, a sense of chaos, inadequate resources for mental health. We've got to do a lot more in the schools with crisis response teams and making sure that social workers and training are happening in our schools to stop the root of violence that our teens are experiencing. So it starts with young people. And it goes to the inadequate mental health resources, but yes to all the things we need to do for common sense gun regulation.
Thank you very much. You've answered a dozen questions, and we have barely scratched the surface in terms of issues that are important to the state and to the individuals in the state. But I think a dozen questions is intellectually and emotionally draining enough. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to ask each of you to spend a couple of minutes summing up, perhaps addressing issues that we haven't mentioned that are important to you, or just wanting to make sure that the people who are listening today or who will listen on YouTube have a better sense of who you are and why you are running. And I'd like to start with Candace.
Thank you, Margie. I appreciate all the questions tonight and getting and having this opportunity. Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I am Candace Bouchard. I've been in the Concord area for over 30 years. My husband and I bought our home here. I've been active in the community on many levels of volunteering, whether it was with NARAL, New Hampshire, domestic violence, safe routes to schools, always finding a way to volunteer and pitch in where needed. I've served 8 terms in the New Hampshire House. 2 of those terms, I was chair of the Public Works and Highways Committee. 1 term, I was chair of the Transportation Committee, and I'm now serving my 6th term as a city councilor in Concord's Ward 9, which is the most diverse ward in the city of Concord, with housing, income, and education. I juggled all this when I first started serving in the House and volunteering. I was a mom, my son was in elementary school, I work part-time, and I understand how difficult it is to juggle all these jobs and still try to be effective in your community and get things done. I'm running now because I believe with my experience on the municipal level and my experience in the State House, I believe I have the experience, and I was a very effective legislator, and I think legislator, and I believe that counts now, especially as we go forward with the pandemic and the destruction it's doing to our revenues and our budget. I'm a fighter. I'll be there. I know we have a budget that we have to protect. We have to protect the workers, we have to protect the families, and we have to protect the benefits of our retirees and state workers. What I'm passionate about is housing. I'm passionate about the lack of housing, the growing homeless population that we have, and it's only going to get greater. The lack of housing for young families and single people to rent an apartment that is affordable, and the cost of property taxes for families to stay in their home. But housing, I think, is my number 1 passion, because if you don't have housing, if you're housing insecure, you're always worried. There's a lot of stress. You're worried about everything. What's going to happen to my family? How am I going to go forward? And I think the housing issue we have now in the state, no matter what community you're in, it's a problem. There's 1% available housing, and it should be around 6%. So I think we need to solve this housing problem, and that's going to be a priority of mine. But I want you all to know that you not only have an ally in the battle to protect our progressive values, but that you have someone who has backed up her beliefs with effective action. I have gotten the job done before. I've passed legislation. I've wrangled bipartisan support. I've been in the trenches with you for years, and I'm looking forward to continuing this work as your state senator. So thank you.
Thank you, Candace. Paul?
Marjorie, thank you. And I want to thank the House Progressive Caucus for an excellent forum. I also want to acknowledge that all 3 of us in the race present difficult choices for voters. We basically all agreed on the issues. And so something else is at work. We each bring different backgrounds and experience, and the voters can look at the issues, but they can also look at our experience. I probably have the most varied background of anybody in the race. Worked as a lawyer, been a community leader. I was the first chairman of the board of the Capitol Center for the Arts, led many boards in the Concord area, Family Strength, the Children's Alliance. When I went to Congress, I was able to pass really important legislation. I passed Michelle's Law, which was the basis for the provision in the Affordable Care Act that allowed young people up to 26 to stay on their parents' policies. That's brought coverage to 6 million people. I created the Northern Border Commission for a state-federal partnership that's brought over $40 million in economic development to the state. I know how to work across the aisle. I know how to work in a legislature. With a varied experience, I've also worked through crises. I was in Congress during the financial crisis and helped lead us out of it on the Financial Services Committee. So we're going to have to dig out of the pandemic. When we do, the state budget is a policy document. It tells us what our priorities are. As a member of Congress, and when I get to the state Senate, I know how to focus on the state budget and set those priorities and look for other sources of revenue that we're going to need. There are sources of revenue that I think we need to explore that reach those who can afford to pay. I'm also going to look at creating a public bank, which I believe could really help solve our revenue issues. We can aggregate state and municipal funds and invest them in New Hampshire for the benefit of New Hampshire citizens. We can use it for green infrastructure and even leverage private capital. We should legalize cannabis as a source of revenue. And when we do, we can use a state public bank to bank that revenue, because otherwise it can't be banked. We don't want to send it over the border to Massachusetts. And we've got to legalize cannabis so that we're not sending people to other states and then having them violate law by coming across the state lines. I'm passionate about energy and the environment and climate change. I'm working in that field now. So there are lots of things we can do to move us forward. New Hampshire should be a leader on dealing with the climate crisis, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes economic sense. It is the path forward to creating new green jobs, to bringing economic revival to the state at a time when we clearly need it. We're going to have to prioritize the most vulnerable among us, our working families, our kids, our seniors, those with disabilities. We're going to have to stand strong to make sure that New Hampshire and the democratic values we care about are what are reflected in the state budget as we dig out of this hole. It can be done, but it's going to take experienced leadership that's focused on the future. And that's what I'm going to bring as your state senator. So I hope you'll vote for me. I hope you'll visit my website, friendsofpaulhodes.com, or visit the Facebook page. There's a long way between here and the primary date. And I know I'll be working every day to earn your vote and your support. So thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Becky.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks again to our host, the Progressive House Caucus, and to Representative Smith for these fantastic questions. I love these policy debates. It's really the best part about campaigning, talking to voters and talking about the issues. So again, my name's Becky Whitley, and I'm running to be the voice of working parents in the New Hampshire Senate. I've dedicated my entire career to helping others and standing up for the issues that really matter to Granite Staters. I love New Hampshire, and as your state senator, I want to make it the best place to live and work. We need a deep commitment to meeting the trials of the moment while rebuilding New Hampshire in a way that maintains our unique way of life, but also is more equitable and inclusive and sustainable. And I think I bring that experience to this race. I started my career as a disability rights lawyer with the Disability Rights Center in New Hampshire, representing children and families and individuals with disabilities on any issue related to their disability. I did work in the special ed system. I represented folks in employment discrimination. I represented children who were stuck at the Sununu Youth Services Center. I even conducted the first investigation that the DRC did at the Sununu Youth Services Center, where we exposed children were being abused there. They were being restrained and put in handcuffs when it's supposed to be a place that they were going to be rehabilitated. After my son was born, I stepped away from practicing law and I worked with the Environmental Defense Fund as a climate organizer and grassroots leader with this group called Moms Clean Air Force. And what we did was to organize parents to take action on climate by showing folks that the climate crisis was also a public health crisis that was going to impact our children's health. And I really developed the know-how through that work and through my community work to fight for clean and renewable energy solutions and zero waste policies and improved renewable energy programs. I spent many years thinking through those issues. And then most recently, I have worked as the policy director for the Children's Behavioral Health Collaborative. And doing this work at the State House, I was able to work with elected officials across the political spectrum to push for reforms for our most vulnerable children and families. Most recently, I was instrumental in the passage of Senate Bill 14, which transformed how we serve our most vulnerable children. This bill brought $20 million to the children's behavioral health system, created mobile crisis units that can go to families and go to schools, and it also brought much needed reforms to the child protection system. There have been so many reports that have come out from the state, criticizing our child protection system, our most vulnerable citizens, and Senate Bill 14 implemented a number of important recommendations that told the state to integrate children's mental health with child protection, with the substance misuse system, with the prevention system. So it was a systems integration bill, and it was a bill that brought much needed services to children, because no parent should have to choose between calling the police or having their child wait in the emergency room for days. That is not where we should be serving our most vulnerable children in crisis. And so I have worked on the ER boarding crisis by getting services in the community, shifting our precious resources away from institutions and towards community-based services. I have that experience as both a disability rights lawyer and as a policy person. And I'm a mom and I'm an engaged community member. I was an active member as a young professional living in Concord, and now an active member of the Hopkinton community. I understand the importance of strong public schools, and I see what the lack of appropriate funding can do to communities. A lot of folks move to Hopkinton because of how tight-knit our community is and how civically engaged we are, and it's been painful to go through these budget discussions and know that the issue is a larger one and one of a lack of public funding. So I think as we move out of the COVID pandemic, it's time to demand bold and just change that really translate our values into meaningful actions. And I think that's going to require a fresh perspective from really compassionate leaders who bring a different type of experience to the table. And as a disability rights lawyer, a climate activist, and a health policy specialist, I have that expertise, and I also have the tenacity to really take on the toughest issues and the hands-on experience in creating systemic change. So thank you so much for having us, and thank you to my other candidates. This is always so much fun to do this together.
Well, thank you all very, very much. I also want to particularly thank Kathy Rogers, who is a skilled timekeeper and a sensitive timekeeper, because she knew that it was important to give each of you as much time as you needed to sum up at the end. And I think that was a significant quality addition. It was my honor to be able to serve as your moderator, and I, on behalf of the New Hampshire House Progressive Caucus, and we wish you all well. And I think this is probably unnecessary. I don't imagine anybody listening at the moment doesn't know this, but if you have not applied for your absentee ballot, do so immediately by contacting either your town or city clerk or the Secretary of State's website. Get your application in, your request. You'll get a ballot back. Fill out that ballot and drop it off at Town Hall or City Hall, or mail it as soon as you get it. What matters most is that everybody votes. You should also each take it upon yourself to contact 10 different people to make sure that they've done what they have to do to vote. Thank you again very much, and see you on Election Day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you so
you.
much for participating. It was a
Thanks.
wonderful forum.
Thank you, Marjorie, for stepping in at the last second. And I just want to say something since I've got you guys all here, and this is my district, that I'm excited. Definitely one of these folks is our next state senator, and I'm excited to work with you. So thank you all for attending, and I'll send out the link to the video from this as soon as we have it available. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Chris.
all.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.